15, verses 1 through 8. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. Those who abide in me, and I in them, bear much fruit. Because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, and that you bear much fruit and become my disciples.
The lesson this morning, Jesus talks about vines and branches and vine dressers. You get this sort of image that everything is entangled. And entanglement is not a pleasant image to think about. I mean, I used to have an electric mower, and I had a 100-foot cord to propel my electric mower. And I had to learn how to mow my yard without, one, running over the cord, and two, keep it from getting entangled in the bushes and the trees and everything else. And then once I was done mowing my yard, I had to figure out how to get that cord back in a place where it won't get tangled. Of course, you do this with your arm and you wrap it around. And for whatever reason, when you put it in the garage and you come back and get it in a couple days to mow your yard again, it has all mysteriously got entangled with one another. And so it's really frustrating. And that's what we tend to think of when we think about being entangled in something. Whenever I've gone to legal seminars for the church, the lawyer for our conference, the conference chancellor, Phil Moots, is a really great guy. I've known him for a number of years, but he's always talking about how we could avoid legal entanglements, and is always giving us instructions of what we need to do to make sure we are not entangled in anything. That's for the image of when we get entangled in something. This is not a good thing to be entangled in something. I remember once we were putting together some kind of dining fly in the backyard, and all the strings and everything, the ropes that were trying to nail it down, all got entangled. And someone in the party just picked up the rope and just threw it in the air. And he said, "It's just as likely that chance could probably untangle this better than I could." So that's what we think of when we think in terms of being entangled. And yet Jesus gives us this metaphor of God and Him and us all somehow or another entangled with each other. And we and our neighbors and the world all somehow entangled with each other. That somehow or another, part of being an active participant in the Christian faith is acknowledging the fact that we are entangled souls, that we all in one way or another are connected to each other. And Jesus goes on to tell us that the question for us then is, how do we live in the midst of that entanglement? And if we live well in it, we will express a life and live a life that is faithful and joyful and celebrative, and we will all celebrate that whole sense of being entangled with one another, connected with one another, interdependent upon one another. But if we don't do well with it, we can make a mess of things. We can make a mess of things. And of abide. Doing well is abiding in Him who is the center of all things, abiding in Him who watches over us as we live out our lives, not to come down on us when we fail, but to nurture us and help us back when we're fallen. This whole sense that all things are interconnected. Joseph Campbell, the history of religions professor who passed away in the late 90s, you may remember he did a series of interviews with Bill Moyers on the power of religious mythology and religious systems and all that. He says that one of the four things that all religious traditions seem to be about is this whole sense that all things in heaven and earth, all things are somehow interconnected. We're all entangled with one another. And so when we do something here, there is often an outcome over here that we may not even be aware of. But it's all because of the entanglement. I hear a lot in people who works with physics and sciences talk about chaos theory. And the way it's been explained to me is that chaos theory is that often things happen in a world that we have no control over, but happen because a singular event far away triggers another series of events. And the example is a butterfly flaps its wings in the Himalayas, and that begins a series of small meteorological events that work with and against each other. And over time it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And in a couple of weeks you got tornadoes dancing through the Great Plains states, all connected to that singular event of a butterfly flapping its wings thousands and thousands of miles away, because everything is interconnected. Everything is dependent upon each other. This is the vision that Jesus gives us for living our life together in faith. That we understand that God has created everything in such a way that it is important, and that the whole world thrives on this interconnectivity, this interdependence, like this entangled vine. But you know, it's a hard lesson for us, especially those of us raised in Western culture. Because in Western culture, we don't think in terms of all things being interconnected. All things in heaven and earth, intertwined, interconnected, entangled. We send our children off to school, and they learn very early that there is an hour set aside for math, and an hour set aside for science, and an hour set aside for history, and an hour set aside for English, and an hour set aside, 15 minutes set aside for play, for recess. And we do this in our culture. We take the big picture of everything and break it down into smaller parts. And we do it in part because we have to, because the big picture is so amazing and so large. But what happens is we begin to develop in our life, in our culture, this idea that we can compartmentalize things. And when we start compartmentalizing things, then all of a sudden the poetry and the beauty of this order that God has created, where all things are interconnected, gets lost. It's not just in education. We have our religious life, one compartment. And we have our work life, another compartment. And we have our social life, another compartment. And we have our personal life, another compartment. And our family life, another compartment. And sometimes we get really good at living in each each department aloof from each other compartment. I don't want to get political here, I really don't. I have to really fight the temptation because I minored in political science when I was in school, and I'm always fascinated by what these people are doing in politics. But in the 1990s, we all remember what this country went through when the 42nd president of the United States got himself in trouble. And he got himself in trouble with some inappropriate behavior with an intern. We all know, we all remember, those of us who lived through that. It was all very painful. And I don't want to be judgmental or critical, but I remember through all that time, the big question people were asking is, how can a man who has a devout relationship with his faith, and everything I read about the fellow is that he did and does have a very devout faith out of the Southern Baptist tradition, could possibly fall so far, so often, because he had a reputation for this. How can he make those two things work? And the consistent thing I kept reading about is, well, he's a master of compartmentalization. I got this situation here, I got this situation here, I got this situation here. And people that have worked with him say that when you go to a meeting with him, he makes you feel like he agrees with you 100%. Because he's got a little compartments of what you were saying. And maybe leaders of the free world have to do this to just sort of deal with all the stuff they have to deal with. I don't know. But it was a very painful experience for all of us in this country to watch all this stuff unfold. And it unfolds often because we compartmentalize certain things in our life. What we do at business is business. What we do with family is family. What we do at church is what we do at church. And here Jesus is suggesting that the posture of faith, the way to live our lives, if we really want to be embellished by a healthy and vital relationship with our divine parent, requires that we begin to see all things in some way or another related to one another. And if we begin to see this, then suddenly our whole view of the world begins to change. We become more reticent about going to war with somebody who may be different than us or have a different view of the world. We might be more careful with how we use the environment, the creation, the ecology around us. We begin to realize that God has so created life that everything is important and deserves reverence and is a blessing. And is a blessing. And so we look after each other, and we look after our planet, and we look after the creatures that are part of that planet. You know, in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, I love the part where Adam names the creatures. He gives names to the creatures. Because one of the most powerful moments in my life was when my daughter was born. My daughter was born after a very long, intensive night. My wife suffered so with the labor She went into that hyper labor where she was in a lot of pain and then just little. And I tell people it was the most difficult night of my life. And she looks at me. She's at work this morning at the historical point, so I can talk all about it. Of course, her parents are sitting here, so I get to know. But anyways. And I can remember when Caitlin was born, it was 7:38 in the morning. And the reason why I remember it so well is I'm standing there by my wife, and I can't see Caitlin when she's born from where I am. And so I asked, well, what is it? Thinking boy or girl. Because in those days we didn't always know. Today everybody knows, but in those days we didn't always know. And when you get old, you get the feeling of what you can say in those days, you know. And the nurse, God love her, she says, well, it's 7:38. I didn't care what time it was. I didn't know if I had a son or a daughter, you know. And I said, no, what is it? And she said, it's 7:38. And I said, no, what is it? And she says, it's 7:38. And I'm going, I want to know if she's a boy or a girl. Oh, you have a daughter. And then she said to me, what will she be called? What will she be called? And that moment I got to name her. My wife had to put up all that work and labor and everything, and I got to name her. Because we worked this out before. And I said, she will be called Caitlin. I can remember that in exact detail. It's like the minute I said she will be called Caitlin, I knew there would be a connection between this little thing who grows up to be a brassy thing who lives in Phoenix and chases down stories and says to me, oh, Dad, you don't know what you're talking about. There can be a connection that will never, ever, ever be broken by me. All around the simple act of naming. And so when you folks bring your babies to me to baptize them, and I get to hold them in the arms, and the first question I get to ask is, what did you name this child? What will he or she be called? And all of a sudden, because of the naming, everybody in the room has a connection to this child. There is nothing in this world that could sever that connection, save our own arrogance and impatience. But just the naming. And so when Adam names the animals, he names the plants. God's purposes to celebrate all things in heaven and earth are being met. All things in heaven and earth are interconnected. When we learn that, live out of that, abide in that, the world begins to heal. You are loved and a blessing